So yes, let's get started. So as mentioned, I'm Kirchner and the manager for research data services in the division for research services in the library. My email address is there. If you have any follow-up questions afterwards, you're welcome to reach out. So broadly defined, research data can be considered as any recorded information obtained during a research process, uh, irrespective of the form or media that is used, was used, and is then used to generate or validate scientific claims. This does consist of intangible data such as statistics, programmatic findings, conclusions, code, and tangible data, photographs, physical specimens, electrophysical recordings, 3D models, modified organisms, and so on. In terms of the preservation of the research data that we speak of at the university, it's usually the digital form. The physical specimens are often stored in physical storage, obviously, but usually there's a digital record of those specimens, and in that case, we will be speaking specifically about that kind of digitized research data. Yeah, and as I said, I mean, it's any form of data that gets collected, whether it's an interview, whether it's surveys, documents, audio, visualizations, video, satellite imagery, even a presentation can count as research data if it contributes to any kind of scientific finding or claim. And the reason why there's a lot of emphasis these days on research data management is that the lifespan of a publication versus the lifespan of data can often be very highly contrasted. A publication, once it's been stored, if it's your thesis or your dissertation and it's been put on SunScholar, it's there for perpetuity and as long as SunScholar will exist. And same with research articles, conference publications, those journals preserve that publication. But for the longest time, the data that accompanies this research hasn't had the same kind of preservation requirements. And therefore, the lifespan of unmanaged data is often very surprisingly short. Whether it's because it's obsolete software, lost physical storage, staff turnover, or simply unreadable formatting, data can oftentimes just disappear into the void. And without active stewardship, the foundational evidence of your research is highly vulnerable to degradation. And because of this realization, and the concept of research data management is actually quite a new concept in the research universe, essentially. The Stellenbosch University developed a research data management regulation to help safeguard and put in certain guidelines, regulations, expectations of how data must be handled and managed. And it's not designed to police researchers, but it is rather a framework built to protect you, your participants, and the institution from financial repercussions and reputational damage. It ensures that every data set has a designated steward and is managed with the highest ethical integrity. So, with regular national and international laws like POPIA and the GDPR in Europe, and even funder requirements, the regulation helps guide researchers on how to properly manage their data. So the four core purposes of the regulation is to ensure legal, ethical, and contractual compliance. So ensuring that the university's research practices with South African and it complies with South African and international laws, including privacy, intellectual property, and ethical research standards. It establishes governance principles, so provides a foundation for responsible data handling, ensuring research subjects are protected and data is managed with integrity and transparency. It further defines the roles and responsibilities, so clarifies the duties of all SU members, researchers, students, and the support staff, so that every dataset has a designated data steward responsible for its long-term preservation and accessibility. And then to promote the best practices and impactful sharing. So it guides researchers and students in managing, storing, and sharing data effectively, enabling broader access where appropriate and maximizing the visibility and impact of SU's research. So before continuing, who would you say, you can answer in the chat, is the data steward? Who would be assigned as the data steward? Anybody? Okay, I've got two answers there, and both are technically correct. Yes, the principal investigator, you as the researcher, would be the data steward. A supervisor takes on a supervisory role and can also be held responsible for the management of the data. But oftentimes, what can happen is that sometimes in the agreement, the consent form that you have with your research participants, you might indicate that you as the researcher will be the only one who has access to the raw original data that is collected. So in that case, that means that even the supervisor cannot actually have even the supervisor can't have access to that data. So that will always mean that the researcher, the principal investigator, will be the core steward. But the supervisor plays a very important role in that they must provide guidance on how this data is managed, ensuring that the necessary safeguards are in place as well. Okay. So, and the objectives of the regulation that we do have in place is it's intended to ensure that research data created, received, or analyzed as parts of the research process are compliant, so that it meets legal, ethical, contractual, and funder requirements, that it is fair, that meaning that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, open, aligns with responsible sharing and transparency standards, secure, that it protects internal, confidential, and restricted data appropriately. So very important to note here that we do say that as far as possible, data must be open, but it must be as closed as necessary as well. And then preserved, that's data is retained with quality metadata for 10 years from date of project conclusion, unless otherwise required. So then that comes to the question of what is research data management that this regulation has now stipulated. It is a core principle of good research practice and scientific integrity, and it consists of two continuous actions, planning and controlling. So planning meaning strategizing how data will be managed both during and after the research process, and controlling meaning actively governing the collection, processing, analysis, sharing, dissemination, and curation and reuse of the data. So there's effort. It takes raw efforts to get this done, but it will ultimately contribute to the longevity and of your scientific legacy. So like we have with the research life cycle, there's a research data management life cycle as well. In terms of the active involvement of various support services that will depend on what stage you are currently involved in. So stage one, data management planning, anticipating the methodologies, ethical compliance, and structural needs before generation even begins, is one of the places where we in the library can assist you with a platform called SunDMP, which is a data management planning tool that we have made available to our researchers. Then obviously it continues with the data collection stage, the data processing and analysis stage. And the final three stages is where we get involved again as well. The data sharing and dissemination. Where are you going to store your data? Can it be made publicly available? Can it be shared? Does the funder require it to be open access? The curation of that data. So applying appropriate metadata standards so that that data is as discoverable and accessible as possible. And then ultimately what's the goal would be the reuse of the data. That future discovery and secondary application will drive new research questions and increase your research's impact. So as mentioned, the two core pillars being planning and controlling will ultimately lead to sound research data management, which is a core principle of good and ethical research practice. And there are some tangible returns on this active data stewardship as well. For you as the researcher, it can lead to greater discoverability. That not just your publications, but your data as well can be used in future research and drive the impact of your research. Therefore, increased citation efficiency prevents duplication of efforts. If more and more data becomes discoverable, and you find that somebody has already done the same kind of data collection that you actually intended to do, you could rather build on what's already been done than starting completely from scratch. And that attracts new funding and global collaborations. For the funder, increased visibility and reuse of that funded research, a greater return on investment, and then the seamless validation of published research as well. That's one of the core elements in terms of why it's so important that the data that's contributed to a research publication must in some way be discoverable, is that for those who wish to replicate or just to ensure that the data is sound, that they have access to it. And then for the public and the institution, transparency of the research process, data-driven decision-making, and ensuring publicly funded research flows back to empower society. And given that the university, one of our core strategic objectives at the institution is research for impact, making our data available as far as possible can contribute to the betterment of society. So I briefly mentioned the FAIR principles earlier, and the FAIR principles is a core underlying principle of sound research data management. So if we talk about findability, the question is, can humans and computer systems easily discover this data set or the metadata associated with it? Is it accessible? Is the protocol for retrieval standard and open? So that does not mean necessarily that the data is open, but the means of requesting access where possible is open and available. Is it interoperable? Can it be integrated with other data sets? Does it use common vocabularies and readable formats? So do you follow the correct standards for your type of research to ensure that the data can seamlessly be integrated? But in the same way, is the file format also open? Is it a proprietary file format that means that you need access to some kind of specialist software to access it, or is it an open source format that can be opened with open source systems as well? And then the reusability. Is the licensing and the provenance of the data clear? So you would be assigning, if you can publish your data, you would be assigning a certain license on how it should be used. The standard most commonly used one is CC BY, essentially saying, yes, it can be reused as long as appropriate attribution and citation is in place. So the guiding principle for the regulation and for open data in general is as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So although we champion open access to remove barriers and increase socioeconomic impact, we still do need to acknowledge that the protection of personal information, intellectual property, and culturally sensitive indigenous knowledge will always dictate where your data sits on this spectrum. So, I mean, you can, depending on the nature of your research data, it can be open, but understandably, there is certain data that can remain closed for a set period or permanently closed. I see there's a question, so I'm going to pause here quickly just to read there. HREC always asks, how long are you going to keep your data? 5 to 10 years allowed. But now if you must make your data available to other researchers, how can you make your data available if there's a strict confidentiality clause? If there's a strict confidentiality clause, then you can't make it open. And that is the contract or the consent of the research participant, or if you're collaborating with a private company in your research project, what they dictate will always go first. So in terms of the longevity of the data, if we have SunScholarData available, for instance, as a platform, where we kind of ensure that the longevity of the data to be stored there. It's not the raw data that we necessarily publish on it. We publish the work, the final product of the data, essentially. I just want to make sure that I understand it. Yeah, so just to be sure again, so in one way, the data that you want to keep would be the raw data product, and that would usually be an internal instance, from what I understand, and would need to be secured by your department or your faculty. But what now if you must make your data available to other researchers? Yes, so there is the option of internal sharing or sharing between institutions, and we will be coming to that as well. So one of the main core catalysts for this drive for open data where possible is funders. Funders these days increasingly mandate that if it can be made publicly available, if it can be shared openly, the data must be shared. So if it's not sensitive information, if it's not personal information, if there's not any kind of confidential geographic information related to endangered species, if there's a patent pending, if there's a publication pending, all of these stipulations will always determine when or how or if you can actually openly share the data. But funders will they will want to know this ahead of time, and therefore that is why we have SunDMP in place, and because funders, they want a data management plan to accompany their applications. If in that data management plan you stipulate that this is going to be confidential information, it cannot be made publicly available, the funder will accept and acknowledge that if the appropriate justifications and rationale is there. But so it can be considered a strict condition, but again, only for those specific data that can be shared publicly. So the further functioning of purpose of a data management plan is that it's a living document that describes precisely what you will do with your data during and after a project. It proves to funders, the ethics committees, and your future self that the data lifecycle has been architected and not just improvised. So instead, this goes into file naming conventions. Is there applicable or relevant data documentation, like a README file or a data dictionary, or other kind of notebook that explains and clarifies the data? Where will it be stored? How will it be secured? How will the data be collected? And once collected, if it's, for instance, let's say it's an interview that you do at a certain location, how will that data be secured until it has been digitally uploaded to an institutionally approved backup system? So for this purpose, we have implemented SunDMP, which is kind of considered known as an intelligent questionnaire. It's based on a knowledge model or a question bank that asks questions, and depending on how you answer the question, it will either lead to some follow-up questions, or you can move on to the next section. And the 6 critical questions it solves for you is: what type and volume of data are you generating? Are you utilizing third-party data? Will you rely on internal SU infrastructure or external tech? How long must the data be retained? Are there POPIA or other security or sensitive information concerns? And what specific rules dictate your funder's mandate? In this way, you can prepare as well. So if you know that you are going to be need a lot of storage space, and at this moment, I mean, students generally have access to 50 gigabytes on their OneDrive storage. So if you already know that you're going to need more storage space, if it's a big data project, if you can indicate this in your data management plan, the funders will acknowledge this and will also then allocate funding for storage, for instance. So it's basically a roadmap of how you're going to handle your research data throughout the entire process. From the start, but because it's a living document as well, obviously, as research progresses, oftentimes things can change and parameters can change. And therefore, you can also update this document. So it's also kind of a record of how you are managing your data. If you need to provide a report midway into your research, this document will also already serve as a relevant document to produce. So in terms of the mandates with the SunDMP tool, it allows for the data assessment, guides users to input critical dataset information, the documentation and accessibility requirements. The fairness evaluation, so it scores the extent to which planned data meets the FAIR principles. This is more for your own measure and for statistical purposes than anything else. Obviously, again, if it's sensitive data, the reusability score on that will then be very low, but that's not really a negative thing because privacy, again, would then be a very core component. It generates templates as well. So once you've finished filling in SunDMP, you can export it in multiple formats, Word, PDF, JSON, HTML, LaTeX, or Markdown-based templates, depending on what the funder requires or what would work best for you and how you would like to, if you need to edit or make any changes to the document. And it's a secure storage of this document. So it archives the document for future reference and easy updating as the project evolves. So in terms of the active collecting and the processing of the data is, this is more where the researcher is primarily responsible. Our faculty librarians can provide guidance and referrals where necessary if you need any kind of guidance here. Also very important to take note of is that in terms of how you're going to collect the data, if you're going to be collecting personal information, obviously the Research Ethics Committee will require knowledge of what kind of data collection tools you will be using, how it will be secured, and how if it's in collaboration with another institution, or whether the necessary data transfer agreement is in place. And then also for the analysis side, what tools will you be using? All this information is already is required by a research ethics committee, and we also have a subcommittee called the RDM advisory group that meets once a week to handle requests based on the requests sometimes for the use of certain tools that's not institutionally supported, for instance. And this does happen. Sometimes you want to use a specific survey tool that's discipline specific, that meets the specific requirements of your specific research, but it's not Microsoft Forms, it's not REDCap, it's not Sun Surveys, and therefore it's not institutionally supported. You would still need to get permission to use that tool. What you need to provide on your side, if you do want to make use of one of these tools, is as much documentation as possible on how this third-party company, how they handle their data that gets uploaded to them, whether they use it for any kind of proprietary development, all kinds of questions like that is very, very important. So if you can provide as much information in your application to use this tool, your request will be processed as quickly as possible. If we talk about the primary and secondary data, primary data can be considered that data which is generated and compiled de novo by administering an original study. So completely new generated data. It hasn't. There's no other data that gets used. Examples of this would be interviews, surveys, focus groups, laboratory experiments, to name but a few. And very, very important to note as well, as with your research publications, the data that you generate alongside this belongs to Stellenbosch University. Obvious exceptions would be if you are collaborating with another institution, there would be co-ownership, and that would usually be outlined in the research contract between these two institutions. Secondary data is information sourced from pre-existing records or literature. And these days, we've got a lot of publicly available data repositories. So SunScholarData is but one. There's many sources of available data out there. And it's always good practice to go and see, isn't there data that I could rather build on instead of really starting from scratch? So to avoid reinventing the wheel, it's a good practice to go and see if there isn't already been data generated in my field of study. And these would be statistical abstracts, states reports, but and a variety of data sets that are available publicly. But you must, in terms of using and having access to this data, it must be rigorously evaluated, corroborated, and checked for secondary use licensing or any use restrictions on it. For instance, again, an example is if you have 100 research participants in a study, and 10 out of that 100 do not consent to other researchers using that data for future research, then that whole data set to a very large extent cannot be made available. And therefore there will likely be a permanent embargo on it if you are still required to upload it or to make it discoverable, at least. So in terms of the storage solutions that's available at the institution, preference is strictly given to institutional storage managed by the SU IT division. And to LIS, the library, in terms of what we provide with SunScholarData. The reason for this is that there are safeguards in place to protect your data from accidental loss, hardware failure, and unauthorized access to your work. And this is especially the case, again, if it's active or sensitive personal information or any kind of sensitive data. Secure SU servers is advisable, and using personal hard drives is a definite no-no. If it's not that sensitive data and you want to collaborate in real time, Teams, OneDrive are actually very good resources to secure your data. If you need additional storage, if the solutions that's openly available are not working for you, you can reach out to the Research ICT Service Desk. The link is here embedded, and we will share the slides as well. And if you can outline your needs, again, a solution can be developed. Sometimes there might be a cost to the department, though. Excuse me. So in terms of the ethics around personal information these days, if personal information is going to be collected, a privacy impact self-assessment will have to be done. This will give you a rating, and based on that rating will determine how serious you must basically take the steps to ensure that the data is anonymized, de-identified, and that there's no breach of contract, essentially. Obviously, again, if there's going to be collaboration between institutions, a formal data transfer agreement must be put in place to govern the access, the storage, the duration, and the potential destruction of the original data if required. So, and sharing this kind of data, oftentimes because it's too large in volume, but also just because of the nature of it. You cannot just share sensitive data over an email. There are approved tools like File Sender, which we have access to at the institution, that allows securely moving arbitrarily large data sets between higher education institutions or individuals without relying on permanent public platforms. Okay, regarding the question, is it okay to keep non-sensitive data on own PC as well as SU OneDrive? That would be good practice in the sense that it would serve as a backup. If something happens to OneDrive, I mean, no safeguard is 100%. That's unfortunately the reality we live in. That is fine, but just keeping it on your own device will be problematic, even if it's non-sensitive. And also then it would be very good to make sure that that data is still secure in some kind of protected file or location on your device, because I mean, personal devices can get stolen as well. And you do not want that research data to get accessed by somebody. Even if they don't know necessarily what to do with it, there will always be a kind of a risk. In terms of sensitive information, personal information, sensitive data, obviously keeping it on a personal device is a very, very big risk and can lead to incredible repercussions. And this has happened. We have had researchers whose laptops were stolen out of their car and they had sensitive data on that. And these things do happen. And the repercussions can be immense. Okay, so basically, once you've finished working and processing the data, the raw data, it's the unstructured files, raw spreadsheets, identifiable participant notes. What we eventually want to be made publicly available to that which can be made available is the processed, high-value, rediscoverable, and compliant FAIR data that is ready for deposit on a research data repository. So in terms of the documentation, attaching a README file or a data dictionary to explain the data, anonymization, ensuring that the data is fully de-identified, that the necessary consent is there, that participants consented to having the data uploaded publicly. And And then format migration, ensuring that the format that it's stored in is an open source format and not a proprietary format, if possible. If it's an Excel sheet, that's entirely possible to save it in an open source XLXS. So I can't remember the exact one now. But docx is another example of an open source word processor format. So in terms of the data sharing methods, local data sharing, if we're talking about the sharing of data, local data sharing would be internal through the intranet file sender, for instance, as well. It's being shared within the institution. This can be the raw data if it's collaborating with a colleague or if it's a research group. And then if there's collaborations with an external institution, as mentioned again, or a private company even, then a formal data transfer agreement is required. In terms of data dissemination methods, this is now when you talk about wanting to make your data publicly available and you want to disseminate it for the broader public in order to have higher visibility, greater impact on your research. Sometimes it's required by the journal, for instance. So a lot of journals these days, they want the data that accompanies a publication to also be published. And again, just to re-emphasize again, the nature of the data that will determine whether this is possible or not, and journals will accept that as well. But yeah, supplementary research data can be submitted along with an associated journal article. So some journals have their own databases. You do get generic or domain-specific research data repositories. So, I mean, sometimes if for the discoverability of your data, it would be good to also upload that data on a discipline-specific repository. The Registry of Research Data Repository is a global registry that lists all the different data repositories that's out there. So you're not restricted to sharing your data just on SunScholarData. That it is one option. We always do advise and recommend that you do upload to SunScholarData if you can, but it's not just restricted. You can upload to others. But in all the cases, there will be kind of a copyright holder or ownership declaration of the data. And there you will always just have to stipulate that Stellenbosch University is the owner of the data. Yeah, then research data published separately in a data journal, where you can provide descriptions of the data sets. And then the institutional research data repository, which we have is SunScholarData, is the other option. So a repository is any computer system whose primary function is to store digital material for use in a library. Most repositories are straightforward systems that store information or a database and present it to the world through a well-defined interface. So SunScholarData is based on the Figshare solution. Figshare is a global open source data, they promote open science, but the platform itself is not open source, rather. But yeah, they're a global solution that offers access, solutions to institutions, to companies for data set storage and discoverability. And they greatly advocate the FAIR principles and ensuring that the data, the metadata accompanying the data is appropriate according to correct requirements. A question: I recently submitted an article to a journal that asked for the data. I said I cannot share it. Do you think this will negatively affect the acceptance? I cannot 100% say. If you can provide them with a legal justification being why you cannot share it, then I think they will, generally, I believe there will be some understanding in place. But I'm a bit, cannot say it with definite clarity. I might actually ask my colleagues, Sizwe, to clarify that as well. Maybe Sizwe, do you perhaps know what the requirements would be?
Okay. Thank you, Kirchner. Actually, this is often listed on the on the funder requirements. For instance, with the NRF, they would expect that your data be made publicly available. In that instance, they would recommend that you make it publicly available without recommending any particular platform. So in that instance, you use the infrastructure that is available locally to you, which is Stellenbosch University. Maybe external publishers may recommend that perhaps your data be published in a particular platform, and then you have to also then in that advice use that particular platform. But also, since you are as a researcher affiliated with Stellenbosch University, we may create a metadata record for that particular data set that we do not host, that is hosted in a third party. That is actually, it speaks to the harvesting projects, Kirchner. But also the determining factor is the funder mandates. If you are funding yourself, use local infrastructure to make your data publicly available. If you are funded externally, read the funder mandates. If it is not clearly mandated, states that use this platform to share your data, and then you can use local infrastructure in form of SunScholarData in this instance. Thank you.
Thanks, Cesar. So one other solution as well, and we have done this before, is sometimes the journal, they just want to see the record of the data. So they want to see the metadata, that it is discoverable. So you could, for instance, I mean, if this is data that cannot be made publicly available, you can upload it to SunScholarData and request to put a permanent embargo on it. So that would mean the metadata would be there. You would link to the article that you wish to publish, the keywords, the description of the data, explaining what it is and so on, and also explaining why it cannot be shared, can all still be publicly visible, but the data itself cannot be accessed. Then you will still get a DOI that can link to that record. And oftentimes this will also be acceptable to journal publishers. Okay, and yeah, here we're basically stepping into the next one. Any of the following grounds, and we've already touched on this, but it's worth just going over it again. But disclosure restrictions imposed by research contracts, prejudicial information that could cause harm, possibility of copyright infringement, patentability of the research data, potential for commercialization, ethical concerns, data privacy requirements, in instances where data contains personal identifiers. Generally speaking, the sensitive data would not be published on SunScholarData. But we can allow for exceptions. As said, it can be hidden behind a permanent embargo. And in that way, the data is still secured, it is still stored, the preservation of the data is still in place, but access to the data remains restricted to you as the primary principal investigator. And yeah, intellectual property as well. I mean, some research can lead to commercialization and can lead to various other impacts as well. So copyrighted materials, patents, trade secrets, and specific designs obviously cannot be shared publicly. If there's a patent pending and you do want to make your data available after the patent has been published, then you can put a temporary embargo in place, for instance. Again, if the funder does require some kind of public record for your data. And here is then the options, the access options on SunScholarData, for instance. So level 0 would be completely closed. Access is restricted and it's only accessible by the data controller. So you as the principal investigator. Level 1 is discriminatory. So access can be granted to specific data subjects or specific collaborators. Level 2 is access is managed and granted to specific, just to clarify, on level 1, access can only be granted on request. So you can allow the option for somebody to request access to the data. Sometimes it's sensitive data, but it's not necessarily, there's no rules or anything in place that restricts sharing of the data. It's simply just because of the nature of the data, it's better to not make it publicly available. But a fellow researcher or somebody in the same field may request access to it. And then that can be determined by you as a principal investigator and your department, whether it's appropriate to share or not to share that data. Level 2 is a bit more controlled, so you can share the data within your specific faculty, so that it's not even or just for the institution. So that means it's not publicly available, but Stellenbosch University staff and students can access it. And then level 3 would be the fully accessible data granted to the public. And as mentioned, you do have these embargo options where you can put a temporary or a permanent embargo in place. The permanent embargo, again, being really for exceptions where the appropriate consent has not been given to share the data or determined by that. So usually if you do request a permanent embargo, you need to provide some justification and explanation as to why this would be the case. Right, so in terms of the support services that the library provides, just an overview again, SunDMP, the tool there, SunScholarData, our institutional research data repository. As mentioned, also, there are some institutional solutions for storage, for collaboration, for data sharing as well. If you're unsure about them, again, just reach out to the Research ICT Service Desk for any follow-up. And yeah, so I've also included in this presentation just a list of some useful links available. So our library guides, the different services available, direct links to the two platforms, SunScholarData and SunDMP. We also have this RDM adventure game that was developed in collaboration with the University of Bath in the UK. It's a choose your own adventure text-based game that can highlight the importance of RDM in certain scenarios and so on for you. It has a qualitative and a quantitative approach that you can select, and it might just evokes a deeper understanding of the importance of this. And some other support links and services available to you. And that's it, essentially. I see there's about 9 minutes left. So yes, if you would like to ask any questions, you can unmute yourself or type it in the chat. And just to give you, while I wait for any questions to pop up, just to give you an overview, this is SunScholarData. And here's the record of the data sets that's been published. So you'll see some has got this permanent embargo, so you can click on it, you can find the information and the description of the data. And you'll see even here, it says that it has been de-identified. But the main reason why this has been restricted is that the participants did not all the participants consented to the sharing of the data, even de-identified. So advice I would give also is that when you do draft your consent forms, informed consent forms, also make it understandable to the participants what it means if you're going to share when they consent to share de-identified information and the potential impact that could have. It can oftentimes just be a misunderstanding on the participant side that why they decide not to approve that specific request. But yeah, here you'll see there's a link to the publication. Necessary information is here. A DOI has been generated for this record, and that usually satisfies the needs of the publishers. And all kinds of data is uploaded here. Here, for instance, is a screenplay that gets uploaded. And there's a whole range, visual data, statistical data, video recordings, all kinds of different types of data has been uploaded. And SunDMP, just to quickly give you a demonstration, I'm just checking the time again. What you will do is you'll create a project, click here, give it a title. I'm just going to say test one. And the template that you will choose is Stellenbosch University DMP template. Then here you'll have all kinds of different fields prompting you with questions. So for instance, if you, depending on, let's say here under the describe the nature of your research data, if you say original data created, you select that, there's no follow-up questions. But if you select, for instance, both, there will be a narrative place where you need to outline how you will be using a combination of original and secondary data. Same here is basically how will you be collecting your data. If you click on other, then you will, for instance, now be able to clarify if these top options are not do not match your specific requirements. And then and so the questionnaire will basically take you through the appropriate steps. You'll make your selections. I'm just doing a couple here. And then finally, once you've finished filling it in, you will go to documents. You'll generate a new document. You can use the Stellenbosch University questionnaire templates. I'm going to just do a PDF. And this takes a few seconds. And then you will get this formatted document ready, outlining basically your answers. It's worthwhile because it's also important to note that not all of the questions, or the questions aren't compulsory. Sometimes there might be a question that's just not relevant to you, and you can actually just leave it out. You don't have to enter an answer if it's not relevant. But be sure of that, because you might get some follow-up from the funder asking why this wasn't specifically covered. And that's it. Okay, now I am going to stop and check for any questions that anybody might have.